Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Tech Intersect Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tanya Evans. And in today's episode, we are again joined by a friend of the show, Ambur Smith, Esquire, a distinguished crypto and cannabis attorney and professor, deeply engaged in this dynamic field, or both of those dynamic fields, also marrying it with the intersection of law and politics and also economic justice. Amber returns to discuss this very pivotal development in crypto and cannabis policy. Vice President Harris, she has a recent initiative, the Opportunity Economy, but more specifically, the Opportunity Agenda for Black men this week, which prominently includes innovations in the cannabis and crypto sectors. Now, there's been a lot of reactionary conversation and think pieces and coverage in order to kind of figure out or read the tea leaves of where policy might go. Also, some criticisms from many different constituencies about whether and if it's ever appropriate to talk about race in the context of these industries. So, today we will dissect the potential impact of such policies, exploring both the opportunities and the challenges that they present. We will talk about all of that and more in a moment. But my good sister, Ambur Smith, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. Lovely. Always lovely to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I could not think of a better person to kind of chop it up as we are both responding and kind of unpacking in real time. We are having this conversation on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 14th, and so what will be, it has yet to be seen, but we are kind of trying to figure out based upon something I personally didn't expect with basically 2 weeks left until the election cycle ends. I don't talk about election day anymore. I've already voted. So many people are early voting. November 5th is when the election ends, not when it begins. So we're in the thick of it. And there are people starting to make up their minds. We've seen many statistics, particularly from the Black community. Black women overwhelmingly support the Democratic ticket, and that is no different whether or not there's a Black woman or a Black person at the top of the ticket. And Black men are the number two constituency that has extreme loyalty to the Democratic Party, but not as strong. And so there's been some concern. Last week, we had former President Barack Obama, who was engaging with Black men who seemed to be on the fence. Some seem to be grappling with this idea of having a woman in leadership. Not the overwhelming majority by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we'd be remiss if not acknowledging this concern that there are still some people, even though there are many, many concerns in the Black community with another Trump presidency, that there is this hesitance that Barack Obama and now Kamala Harris is leaning into. So I just want to set the context for those who were not keeping up with what's going on. Final point, and then inviting you into the conversation. Vice President Harris she sat down with Roland Martin on his show. She is speaking with Charlemagne the God, Breakfast Club, and doing this tour, a week-long tour, speaking specifically to this demographic at the intersection of race and gender, specifically Black men. So just some of your initial thoughts about even that approach, and then let's get into more specifically how this opportunity agenda might align with kind of the best interests of Black men in particular, Black people in general, in the cannabis and the crypto industry.
No, absolutely. And thank you for providing that context, which I think is extremely important whenever we're talking about policy, whether it's related to this current general election or more broadly. Honestly, my initial response was finally good. Glad, right? As a Black woman, as someone who has been supportive of the Biden-Harris administration, and now the prospective Harris-Walz administration, I think that I have an understanding as it relates to the importance of singling out certain groups and talking to them directly. As a Black woman, I have unique concerns. Although we're having a larger conversation on reproductive health, maternal mortality rates among Black women, are such that we could compare the experience in America to that of underdeveloped countries, right? So
Mhm.
as a Black woman, even if someone is speaking to me about reproductive health, they're going to have to address specific issues related to my experience. And I think the same goes for Black men. Whereas I think the policies that were laid out in this agenda would positively benefit all Americans, including Black women and Black communities at large. I do think that we have heard in these final weeks, but honestly, since the election season began, that Black
Mhm.
men are slowly but surely drifting away from the Democratic Party. They're not convinced that they are speaking to them directly, and they do feel like they're being grouped in with other segments of the Black community and communities of color. And so I think that this agenda is a direct response to that criticism, and is a good start. By no means do I think this is an exhaustive agenda. I don't think it has the teeth that will follow for any agenda that would actually be implemented. But I do think that it is a reflection of what seems to be, a true understanding of what Black men want. Speaks to specifically this speaking tour, this that she has been on in the context of an opportunity or creating an opportunity economy. And I think that the campaign is listening, and it may feel like a last ditch effort because we've just had a truncated election season by virtue of her being announced as a candidate in late July. So I think that for those who are supportive of her, or they identify as Black men or otherwise, I think we should amplify this agenda, but also recognize, again, it's a starting point. If there's more to be said on these various topics, if there are more hard-hitting policy agenda items that I think we want to promote, I think this is an opportunity to uplift them. But I don't see the downside in speaking directly to Black men at this moment.
Especially, I'm in agreement, and I had to take a step back to really understand and appreciate this in a broader context, in the context of this specific type of election cycle. You've already mentioned this extremely truncated cycle from someone that goes, 3 months ago or almost less to the top of the ticket to November 5th when we finish voting, right? Most people at a bare minimum run an entire year. They get better and stronger as they kind of float things up to see what sticks, and they refine and form and re-engage. We just did not have the luxury of time at a point in time where um, so many things are on the line. And so to even have this discussion about an issue that is top of mind for a number of people, but certainly not the top line issue by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and that is not without saying that diverse communities over indexed in terms of their ownership of crypto, in terms of participating in the build of the cryptocurrency in decentralized ecosystems. And I also imagine with respect to cannabis, not just uh, uh, to legalize or decriminalize, which I'm starting to understand is a different topic, but also to participate in investment, to participate in ownership of dispensaries and all aspects within the cannabis community. So there's been an interesting similarity and synergy in the development of reasonable regulations in the cannabis industry at the same time, or in addition to what we see in the crypto asset industry. That's why I think that your unique perspective is so important. Talk to us about when you think specifically about BP's new agenda. And again, it's more bullet points and discussion items than an actual policy. But start off by discussing why these sectors might be of significant import or interest, and an opportunity for empowerment, particularly for Black men.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I mentioned, I applaud this desire to speak directly to Black men, but not just about anything, right? They specifically narrowed it in on certain emerging industries, it seems like, which is cannabis and crypto, but the larger Web3 decentralized finance industry were both being addressed. And I think that those two are particularly critical because they speak to the discriminatory systems of policing that have disproportionately burdened Black men and women and communities, but then also the banking systems and the traditional financial systems that have excluded Black men from accessing the resources they need to start businesses across industries, to own homes across the country, right? And so I think that those two, they specifically speak to the ability to build wealth. I think when we think about the cannabis industry as well, folks who have already been involved, if for those with awareness, there has been an attempt at the state level to roll out social equity programs, but even those programs have not ensured that Black men and people have access to the industry as investors, as producers, because they're still subject to subjective licensing programs. There are some lotteries, but even those, right, have been subject to litigation and things of that nature that have left those that can't simply afford those things out in the cold. And so I think that addressing those particular industries and looking at the ways in which folks who have been involved have both been unfairly criminalized and denied access to the resources they need to be successful, I think speaks to the moment that we're in and shows that the administration is aware of where industries are going and what will ultimately make us competitive as a country, right? We think about the impact of creating more opportunity within the Black community, closing the racial wealth gap. That speaks to our overall viability as a country. And so I think it's not lost on me that, I think it was intentional for those two industries to be mentioned. And just to be clear, kind of harkening back to this idea that this is just the beginning, if the policy agenda specifically states that the goal, or at least the reasoning for mentioning cryptocurrencies, was their intention to enable Black men who hold digital assets to benefit from financial innovation, right? Which is what ultimately digital assets are a product of. But we know that, beyond, just being able to access them in order to purchase things as consumers, right? It looks like also empowering them as actual inventors and creative innovators in this space. And then as it relates to marijuana, it specifically speaks to this idea that the goal is to reduce some of those unjust barriers. So break down unjust legal barriers that hold Black men and other Americans back. And the vehicle by which you do that is legalizing marijuana. Because for those who are aware, there are over 30 states who currently have legal recreational programs, but because the federal government has taken a hands-off approach, they handle it different. And so if you're operating from one state to the next, it puts you in a precarious situation. It makes starting a business that much more expensive because of the regulatory framework that you're navigating. So, these are very complex issues that they're trying to address. We've got a couple weeks left to go in this election. And so you don't want to overcomplicate things. When they say when you're explaining things in politics, you're losing. And so I think we have to look at this from a strategic perspective. They're trying to do a lot in a little amount of time, but just know that, to those who can express frustration or support, do that now and the conversation will continue. But I do think this is a great start and a valiant effort at a really Herculean task.
Yeah, it's you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So there was this great push from the Bitcoin and fintech communities to bring crypto to the fore and to be a very strong, lobbying group to move away from choke point 2.0, the aggressive and regulation by enforcement, particularly from the Securities and Exchange Commission under the leadership of Gary Gensler. We've seen kind of hostilities from Senate banking and as well, and a lot of the voices and the faces of these efforts have been white and male, reflecting the broader issues of a lack of diversity in finance and in technology, and kind of finance and tech, come together. And the result is cryptographically secured assets, which is basically a microcosm of the systemic issues of a larger concern that still also in turn reflect the broader society. So this initiative to address specifically Black men, not the least, as an aside, in the context of, groups for Harris, right? There's every conceivable group for Harris, right down the single cat ladies, childless cat ladies, right? There are hundreds of for Harris or for Kamala groups. This is a very focused attempt for constituencies and micro constituencies to not only voice support for Vice President Harris, but also to express their unique concerns within a specific demographic. We didn't have problems with any of those. But now that she's focused specifically on Black men, at a time when Black men have said we feel unseen and unheard, I think there's nothing but good can come from that. Now, context matters, the approach matters, the message matters, but the idea and the effort, I think, has to be supported. And I'd love your thoughts about the fact that this initiative comes at a time when the digital finance space is often critiqued. I've done it in my book, Digital Money Demystify, because of the lack of inclusivity where policy and law is impacted, not in use, not in ownership, not in participation, but in power, right? So, how do you perceive the agenda, if at all, change in the landscape for marginalized communities more broadly, but especially for purposes of our conversation, Black men in crypto in particular?
No, I love that. I mean, I think what you're speaking to is this idea of coalition building, right? And we build coalitions is that we break people down into their individual groups and then we find common ground. And so as it relates to Black men, they have unique concerns, but those overlap with folks in other communities and other coalitions. And so as it relates to crypto and fintech, right, when we think about what's happening in that particular industry, the ways it's disrupting finance in particular, but every industry in the sense that it's changing the way people do business. I think Black men are particularly drawn to these opportunities that they might have been denied prior to now. And so I think that, again, speaking to these issues now is very timely. And speaking directly to Black men is around, building coalitions at a time when we are mobilizing folks to go out and do something with the information they have, not to just sit on it and, debate online, but to actually, take the initiative to go vote and to be involved between elections. I think that's ultimately what we're talking about. And for those that are within these industries, we realize that this work hardly begins and ends with any particular election. And so, I think this presents an opportunity for those who have been hard at work, really developing policy solutions. Shout out to diverse Web3 and DeFi leaders for Harris who have published an open letter that speaks to a more comprehensive policy agenda, that encourages inclusion of Black men and other communities of color, women as well. I think that this is just about speaking to the time, right, and being and ensuring that particular groups feel seen and heard right now.
Interesting about the rapid adoption of cryptocurrencies among Black Americans, both here in the United States and throughout the diaspora, but in particular on the continent of Africa. And I'm wondering what you think are the driving factors behind this trend. You said something just now, and I mentioned at the top about Black folks and brown folks, indigenous folks over indexing in ownership and participation in decentralized finance. What are your thoughts about the driving factors behind this trend? Because I think that also speaks to why it's so important for this demographic to be heard on ways to toe the line between protection. I'm always, whenever I hear that term, I'm a little worried about that, but also opening up the industry for participation. But there are things that bring systemically marginalized people, all the systemically marginalized people to the yard when you have opportunities that remove systemic barriers.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best use case that we have for cryptocurrency and fintech are cross-border payments, right? Have the ability to transfer money to your loved ones in another underdeveloped country quicker than you could through, some of these, traditional money transfer companies and platforms that we're so used to seeing that charge outrageous fees, right? That can be cost prohibitive for those who, are already just making ends meet, but are trying to, again, uplift their families and ultimately their communities across the globe. And so I think that's why we're seeing, greater interest among communities of color, and why we will continue to see that. I think, at the heart of fintech and these decentralized industries is this removal of those intermediaries that have the ability and the discretion to discriminate. When you get rid of the bank and you get rid of the investment banker, my color doesn't matter in a way that I think some folks would like to pretend it doesn't. But we all know that hidden systems of economic injustice have existed throughout history, from redlining to predatory lending. And so, again, that is truly the draw. And, I think that, typically, right, when we think of decentralization, we think of states' rights, that typically align with empowering communities of color, right? Typically the federal government is there to protect, what once was referred to as those insular and discrete minorities, right? Law school throwback. I don't think yeah, we don't use it as much anymore, but you know, that has been the federal government's role, but we've seen the federal government fail in that regard, when it comes to financial access, inclusion, literacy. And so, to the extent that the Harris Walls campaign, their agenda is promoting financial inclusion and financial literacy through promoting cryptocurrency and assets, I think it's about righting historical wrongs. And so again, many would argue it's not going far enough, right? There needs to be other ways to redistribute wealth and create access to wealth building, but I do believe it's a good start. And quite frankly, it's a response to what's already happening. People aren't asking permission to get involved in fintech. We're already doing it. It's just we're asking for the support to help with mass adoption, right? To help those who don't have access to broadband, right? There's so many different barriers to access, from traditional to these newer industries that still exist. And so, but I think the draw stems from, really the elimination of certain barriers that traditional industries have built into them. And I think it's not to be lost on us that, the decentralization of the cannabis industry has worked against communities of color to the extent we don't have the federal oversight that we need. So, I think these industries have been treated similarly. The response or the correct approach is not going to be a one size fits all. But I think that we can learn from the ways in which, or some of the mistakes that have been made as it relates to the cannabis industry, in terms of how we continue to encourage people to learn and develop the literacy around digital assets and financial technology, but then ultimately allow for them to use it to build wealth and close that wealth gap.
Yeah, that's critically important. We've talked in previous shows, previous episodes about this gap. I'll drop some links in the show notes for sure. One to the open letter from the diverse Web3 and fintech leaders for sure, but then also we have great reports about from Paradigm and from other companies and organizations that have led this effort, and data that goes back for many years showing participation of diverse communities for sure. So final things before we get out of here. There has been this really interesting, there are many different words, but let's just go with interesting approaches from the Trump campaign, reaching out to Black men in particular, sensing and seizing on some of the reluctance of a small majority. I'll just go on record and saying, if Vice President Harris does not win, it will not be because of Black women or Black men. At the same time, I can also acknowledge that a few thousand votes in a couple of swing states could move the needle in a way that truly threatens democracy, in my humble estimation. But the GOP nominee has seized on that opportunity. He has leaned in not only for Black men, but more broadly for the Bitcoin and crypto communities, to have him like buying a meal with Bitcoin or speaking at Bitcoin 2024 and making all of these overtures. I contrast that with the broader, more inclusive, and by inclusive now I'm talking about cryptocurrencies more broadly, financial technologies, things of that nature, that is a slightly different message. How might Harris fine tune her message for a both and approach? One that recognizes the innovation and the opportunity, which I think she's already done. We did not hear the Biden administration, I should say President Biden doing that. We have not heard this level of um, uh, 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 pro crypto approach in the history of a presidency. As an aside, when former President Trump was in office on his way out, he and Steve Mnuchin did everything in their power to to build the underpinnings of what we learned later to be Operation Choke Point 2.0. He was against it before he was for it, and then saw a lot of money and leaned into that, so giving additional context. But we would be remiss if we didn't have the opportunity to refine the messaging around what might move the needle for um, a Black man and the Black community more broadly, who benefits from decentralized finance, who benefits from the removal of systemic barriers, also tends to be um, undervalued, underappreciated, not receiving the same opportunities for education. Just because something exists doesn't mean you get to participate. And in what ways Harris can address those concerns, so it's a both and. Not-
No, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I will say quickly, I think you make a great point, right? That Black men are the number two most likely, group to support a Harris Walz administration, have consistently shown up for Democratic candidates. And I think that's worth acknowledging. And I honestly feel that this agenda is in response to that, as opposed to
Right.
the negative attention I think that Black men are often given. I think, but the reality is that again, whether we trust the polls or not, history shows we shouldn't hang on to them too tightly. But
Well,
to the extent that 13% of Black men, meaning only 87% of them, supported a Biden-Harris administration, when it comes down to those thousands of votes, those few percentage points in either direction do really matter. And so I think the campaign has a right to address them directly, has done so, but can continue to go farther. And so as it relates to the both and strategy, I think it's important, as you mentioned, not to come off as protectionist or paternalistic in speaking to the importance of making sure that they're protected as consumers. But I will say, even as investors, financial literacy, right, matters, because there is this assumption that even those who are high net worth individuals have a certain level of sophistication, when really they just have access to investment bankers and folks who can guide them along that pathway. But if we could democratize access to that information, I think the average consumer and retail investor in a much better position. But then we also empower the founders, who I think the administration can do a better job of uplifting and highlighting, because if there is a more sophisticated American public, right, who is likely to adopt this technology, then that means they're going to support the businesses that diverse founders are creating. And so, I think it's about just creating a more holistic image of what it looks like to be a Black Democratic person who is also invested in this industry, but even independence, right? I think there is an opportunity here for, the non-traditional, the someone who isn't traditionally a Democratic voter or what have you, to really see themselves in this agenda. And I think that the administration should take advantage of that opportunity, and just again, just add more context, and make sure that we recognize that they've acknowledged that access to capital is the biggest thing, but that capital can come in different forms, for one, and I think that it's also about helping people build the actual technologies, and so they can benefit from the intellectual property that derives from that. They can benefit from the wealth that uniquely comes from business ownership. And so as we continue to, if the goal is really to empower Black men and Black communities, then it has to address them as producers, investors, and consumers.
yeah, we should end on that point, because I think it's an important one to put a fine point on and to continue to focus on. When I think of, and I wrote about this for Forbes, this idea of an opportunity economy, that the new economy, right, the Web3 economy, presents incredible opportunity, incredible. And to hear to know that, but also to put that in context of Vice President Harris's overall opportunity economy from which this agenda specifically for Black men is pulled, really echoes things that she has been saying and recontextualizing it for a specific demographic. In the same way, you can have 4, 5, 6 pillars for an election platform or campaign platform. It still needs to be nuanced for the particular constituents. We're not a monolith. In the United States, we are this great experiment, this melting pot, if we can keep it. And that speaks to empowering folks to all and equitably participate. Everybody doesn't start off at the same place in space, right? That's the difference between equality and equity, right? And so seeing that in this context, I think is an important opportunity and an opportunity to continue to have this conversation and this dialogue, the recognition that honors and respects people from a position of empowerment, as you said, not paternalism. And two things can be true. So all of this is kind of an experiment as we barrel toward the end of this election cycle. Amber Smith, I'm so excited to always get to chop it up with you about this, as I feel like I'm thinking out loud, that I didn't want to be rudderless. And so having your expertise to share with subscribers, listeners, and viewers is going to be really, really important. So thank you for joining me. Any final thoughts that you want to share to leave this audience better than we found them?
Tanya, thank you for creating this platform and always being at the forefront of these issues. I think it's so important. We're absolutely going to have to continue the conversation. I think that, we are at a very pivotal point in our nation's history, and Black men and people across coalitions are being, addressed directly because their votes matter, their voices matter. And I'm excited to see how the administration is going to continue to demonstrate that, and that hopefully we can see how their messaging to these particular groups continues to strengthen.
Outstanding. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, feel free to follow me on all platforms at Ambur Smith Law. That's AMBUR SMITHLAW. That's Meta. And X platforms. And then you can also connect with me in my firm at the Law Office of Attorney Ambur C. Smith, PLLC on LinkedIn, C. Smith Esquire on LinkedIn.
You need this, sister, on your media outlets. So, you're welcome in advance. If you don't know, now you know. I appreciate you. And we will hear from Amber again soon. Thank you.